Okay, so my name is Joshua. I work for Anartis USA. I'm a winemaking specialist, and so my presentation I'm giving today is how to improve underripe and compromised grapes with, or how to improve underripe and compromised grapes with enological tools. So my job at Anartis, basically, I'm a winemaking technician. So I help winemakers with all sorts of challenges in winemaking and helping improve quality. And so my presentation today is going to be focused mainly on how we can use enological tools for fruit that is underripe or has some issues in terms of botrytis or powdery mildew. I've got a lot of content to go through today because it's a pretty big topic. So I might be sailing through some of these slides rather quickly. If there's any information that we can't get to in the question and answer at the end of the presentation, then you can always reach out to me after the presentation, either by email or by calling our technical line. It's pretty easy to get in contact with me, and we can always have a discussion afterwards as well. So here's a general overview of what I'll be presenting. I'm going to talk first about botrytis a little bit. Again, I am a winemaking specialist, so I did go to school for both winemaking and viticulture, but viticulture is not my specialty. I work more in winemaking. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of how botrytis kind of appears in the vineyard and how it affects the quality of the fruit, and then focus more on the results of how botrytis affects the fruit and the wine quality. So I'll talk about botrytis, the effects of botrytis, tips for handling botrytis affected whites and reds. Then I'll talk about powdery mildew, the effects of powdery mildew, and then tips for handling powdery mildew in whites and reds. And that'll sort of segue into underripe fruit. And then we'll go over to some methods of remediation. And then eventually micro-ox. Hamish is going to take over and present on how we can use micro-ox in a lot of different ways. So that'll be great. So first, we'll talk about botrytis. So botrytis, it has a whole life cycle that it goes through, but basically it appears early on in the spring. It can basically infect early clusters. It can overwinter, and it appears sort of on damaged fruit with, so if you have fruit that gets damaged by either insects or mechanical damage, botrytis will make its way into the clusters. And it first sort of appears like this, where you have some of this shrivel, some of this graying of the clusters on some of the grapes. And then as the infection advances, we've probably seen some of this before if we have experience with botrytis, the sort of formation of this bloom on the cluster itself. And we can get all sorts of degrees of botrytis where we get worsening sort of mummying of the clusters. And eventually we get these spores that sort of form on the clusters themselves, and the cycle sort of repeats year after year. But what I'll be focused on mainly is how the botrytis is going to affect the quality of the fruit. So some of the disease risk factors for botrytis, if we have high humidity and prolonged rain, so greater than 95% relative humidity, with mild to moderate temperatures, temperatures between 50 to 8 degrees, then we can start to have more chances of botrytis. So rot can develop in the vineyards when we receive more than one rain during harvest on mature grapes. The temperature optimum is between 65 and 72 degrees. So in between that range, we have a prolonged period of time, and within that range, botrytis really likes those temperatures. And then when we get above 90 degrees is basically when botrytis starts to struggle with heat. So we're usually a little bit safer above 90, but when we get above those temperatures, basically we're in a safer range. So some of the impacts of botrytis that I'll be talking about, increases in lacase. So lacase is an enzyme that has some very detrimental impacts on quality. We can have increases in acetobacter and other spoilage microbes. So I think you guys are going to be talking about sour rot in the next presentation next week, so I won't go into too much detail there. But just know that in the case of botrytis, botrytis can lead to some difficult situations that involve fruit flies and basically cycling of fruit flies and acetobacter. And so what we can end up with is a lot of microbes on the fruit. And so when we bring that fruit into the winery, we're starting with a situation where we have very high microbial loads in the fruit. And obviously those high microbial loads in the fruit can lead to increases in volatile acidity, increases in risk of spoilage, increases in risk of stuck fermentation. So there's a lot of problems associated with botrytis because botrytis leads to microbial infections more in the vineyard. So that's kind of what we're dealing with when we're talking about botrytis. And I'll try to sort of touch on each of the points and how we can use enological tools to mitigate some of those situations. So first thing that I'll touch on is eliminating competition in a botrytis affected fruit. So when we have botrytis, we basically get higher microbial loads in the juice or in the must when the fruit comes in. So one of the main detriments to having those high microbial loads is that the bacteria that are coming in on the fruit can actually have a problem, can lead to more problematic fermentations in that they can actually inhibit the fermentation. So here's just an example of what that might look like in alcoholic fermentation. So malolactic bacteria can proliferate and grow in the primary fermentation. This is pretty obvious to many winemakers because we have things like co-inoculation where people are purposefully adding malolactic bacteria to a primary fermentation to encourage the malolactic fermentation to happen early. But basically what can happen when we have botrytis is we can have things like Acetobacter proliferate, we can have wild strains of malolactic bacteria proliferate, and that can cause some issues with the primary fermentation and lead to some stuck and sluggish fermentations. So here's another piece of data. On the right-hand side over here, the viability is on the y-axis and the days after bacterial inoculation are on the x-axis. The triangle line there, the line with the triangles and the dark line is just the regular Saccharomyces cerevisiae during fermentation. And the other line is the Saccharomyces cerevisiae with the inoculation of a lactic acid bacteria. So you can see that in the case with this situation, the Saccharomyces cerevisiae viability goes down when we have this, this sort of co-inoculation situation. And we've seen this many times in stuck fermentations. What happens is we have, when we look at the PCR results or when we look at the microbial loads on the fruit, we see that there is oftentimes some sort of malolactic bacteria or Acetobacter present on the fruit. And so the competition between the malolactic bacteria and the Acetobacter is actually driving the sluggish stuck fermentation in that case. So Acetobacter, I'm not showing the data here, but Acetobacter has also been shown to dramatically decrease the yeast viability and fermentation. And it does that through a couple of different ways. One way is by producing acetic acid. Acetic acid can be inhibitory to yeast, or the Acetobacter itself can produce compounds other than acetic acid that can inhibit the fermentation. So one way that we can deal with that is with chitosan. So if you're not familiar with chitosan, chitosan is a polysaccharide that's derived from Aspergillus niger. So it's a polysaccharide that's produced by a fungus. And basically that chitosan is made is they take chitin from Aspergillus niger and they deacetylate it to form chitosan. So what chitosan does is basically it's got a very high charge density and it attracts the cell walls microbes to the chitosan. You can see in this picture over here, this is a electron microscope picture of chitosan sort of zoomed in, and you can see these little sort of specks on this larger sort of asteroid-looking thing. The asteroid-looking thing is chitosan, and these little specks are actually Brettanomyces. And so you can see that the way that it works is it attracts the cells to the surface of the chitosan and basically pops little holes in the bacteria and kills them. Anartis has a version of chitosan that's called pre-activated chitosan, and the name of it is Anartis Stab Micro M. So the way that we prepare our chitosan is that we go through an extra step of acidification and grinding of the chitosan. So you can see the picture here, a standard chitosan has a surface that's a little bit more smooth and flat. The way that we prepare and make our enological chitosan is that it's grinded and acidified to make a more charged dense surface and a surface that's basically more lethal to bacteria and yeast. So Stab Micro M is the name of our commercial version of chitosan. And so here's just an example of how Stab Micro affects different bacteria and yeast that are commonly found in wine and also in must. So it can kill Brettanomyces, it can kill Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, it can kill Acetobacter, Zygosaccharomyces. So it's effective on basically all of the spoilage microbes that are usually problematic in grape must and also in wine. So it's a very handy tool when you have botrytis affected fruit and you have higher microbial loads coming in on the fruit. The Stab Micro can actually be used at any phase of the winemaking process. It can be used early in the must. It can be used in the fermentation because of that. That's the unique benefit of this tool is that you can actually use it during fermentation. You can use it early in the must. You can use it in wine. And it basically knocks back any microbial loads that you have in the must. So it's very useful for that reason. And so that's sort of one of the tools that you can use if you have botrytis affected fruit is when the fruit comes in at crush or as soon as you have pressed and have juice, you can treat that juice or must with the chitosan. And if you're working with must, you would do a pump over, usually for 20 or 30 minutes if possible, with the chitosan in suspension. The way chitosan works is the more contact you give it in the actual must or in the juice or wine, the more effect it has. And so you would treat that must when it comes in with the chitosan, and it'll remove a lot of those bacteria and wild yeast that may cause issues in the fermentation and issues with VA increases as well. So that's one of the ways that we can deal with the higher microbial loads of fruit as it comes into the winery. Another problematic situation with botrytis is the production of lacase. So lacase is an oxidative enzyme. Oxidative enzymes, polyphenol oxidases is a class of enzymes, and lacase belongs to that class. And essentially what lacase does is in the presence of oxygen, it will take phenolic material and change it into a quinone. And so that quinone will go to bind with other quinones and it forms brown pigments. So this reaction happens in other parts of nature. It happens in fruits like an apple when you cut it. The enzyme that does that is not lacase, it's polyphenol oxidase, but it's the same kind of reaction that's happening. And so lacase is particular to botrytis cinerea in grapes. It doesn't really occur naturally in fruit that doesn't have botrytis. And the reason why lacase is such a problem is it actually can deteriorate your phenolic material. So phenolics are really important for quality in wines and in general. If you decrease the amount of phenolics, you may end up with a wine that's very thin, a wine that doesn't have any ageability, and a wine that's very low in color as well. So over here on the right, you can see a couple of charts. We have 3 different classes of phenolics on the x-axis. We have total phenol content, total tannin, and total anthocyanin. And then on the y-axis, we have milligrams per gram of the seed or skin that they're actually measuring. And so what they did is they measured healthy seeds and healthy skin from grapes, looking at phenolic content, and then they looked at infected fruit, at the infected seeds and infected skin to look at the phenolic content as well. And you can see in terms of total phenols, the infected skin of botrytis affected fruit has drastically decreased in the phenolic content, drastically decreased in the tannin, and drastically decreased in the anthocyanin. So we have less tannin, less phenolics, less color. And that's problematic for all the reasons I mentioned. So there's a couple of different ways that we can treat lacase. We can try to use sulfite, although that's a really bad sort of solution because lacase requires a very heavy dose of sulfite in order to inhibit it. You would have to go up to 200 parts per million in the must in order to inhibit it. And there would be all sorts of problems with doing that. So I don't recommend trying to use sulfite to inhibit lacase in botrytis affected fruit. We can use must heat treatment. So thermovinification, flash détente will get to a high enough temperature that you can denature the lacase and actually completely remove the activity. So that's one effective treatment you can use, is actually using thermovinification or flash détente. And depending on what temperature you get the must up to will depend on how quickly you're able to remove that activity. And so that's a very useful way to actually get rid of the enzymatic activity prior to fermentation. Another thing that we can use is enological tannins. So enological tannins have been shown to actually decrease the activity of lacase. And so here's a study that was done in 2019 looking at different kinds of tannin in the sense of gallotannin, elagotannin, grapeseed tannin, grape skin tannin, quebracho. And you can see that all of these different tannins have some effect on decreasing the activity of lacase. So on the y-axis, we have residual activity. And many tannin, we see the residual activity of the actual lacase down to about 30%. So enological tannins are another tool that you can use early in the process. So typically I'd recommend when it's being crushed, or as soon as you have, especially if that has juice, is when you would try to get the tannin in. So the sooner you get the tannin in, the more phenolics you're going to be able to retain in the must, and the less lacase activity you're going to have. And so something like our tannin antibotrytis is basically a blend that we made specifically for this effect. So it's a blend of different tannins to inhibit lacase in botrytis affected fruit. And so you would use a dose between 20 and 40 grams per hectoliter in the incoming must, and we can decrease or limit the enzymatic activity to a much higher degree with something like enological tannins. Another fact we need to consider, so the production of glucans. Botrytis can affect the fruit by producing glucans. Glucans are polysaccharides that are detrimental for clarification and filterability of the must. So, and many times in botrytis affected musts, when in white juices, we'll have difficulty with clarification. So we'll find that we're not able to actually clarify the juice very well. And in red wines, what we find is after fermentation, when we press the fruit out, we'll have difficulty with clarification. And then the worst situation is when we have difficulty with filterability. So winemakers who are not aware of this situation and have some botrytis in their fruit, what they'll do is they'll make the wine as they would. At the end of the process, when they go to filter the wine prior to bottling, they find that they are clogging filters and they're unable to actually filter the wine. And that's oftentimes because of glucans that are present. So basically glucans increase juice viscosity and they clog up filters. So over here on the right is just looking at the effect of different concentrations of glucans on the amount of filterable wine. And you can see that as we increase the amount of glucans, we decrease the filterability. And so trying to deal with those glucans is important. And one tool that we can use for that is glucanase enzyme. So we just came out with a new enzyme specifically for this purpose. It's called Zyme Easy Filter. And Easy Filter combines pectinase and glucanase enzyme activity. So pectinase activity is to remove pectin that's naturally present in the fruit. And the glucanase activity is designed to remove the glucans that can be produced from botrytis. But also the glucanase activity can work to liberate manoproteins from yeast cells post-fermentation. So it improves the amount of manoproteins you have in your wine and therefore mouthfeel. And it improves clarification and filterability. So when used in a juice, this enzyme can deteriorate the pectin and glucans in a matter of hours. If you wait until after fermentation and use it in the wine, it can take up to 3 weeks for the enzyme to work because it takes more time in wine than it does in juice. So we do recommend, if you have a botrytis affected lot, to use this in the juice or in the must rather than in the wine, because it's basically going to work much more quickly and more effectively. And it'll improve the clarification speed of the must and improve the extraction of manoproteins as well. So using it early is better. So we did a quick trial with a winery looking at the application of this in wine. And this was in a lot that wasn't even affected by botrytis. It was actually a lot that just had quite a lot of pectin in it. And what we found is that after treating with the Easy Filter, when we compared a non-treated tank of the same wine to a tank that was treated with the Easy Filter, after 3 weeks, we saw a dramatic improvement in the actual filterability of the wine. and we were able to filter the wine about 30% faster than without treatment. So that can save you a lot of headache, and it can actually make the difference between being able to filter a wine and not being able to filter a wine later in the process. So I've just sort of blown through 3 different things that can help with botrytis, and now I'll switch to powdery mildew. So here is just a little article that I was sort of looking online to see if I could find what kind of pressure we were looking at for powdery mildew this year. And I found this nice article looking at the powdery mildew fungicide resistance. And this sentence jumped out to me. It said, due to the current forecasted weather conditions in 2020, there's significantly higher chance of powdery mildew disease this season. Let's talk about powdery mildew in a little bit more detail here. And so powdery mildew is a fungus that grows in the vineyard. It does not need free moisture to germinate after initial germination. So it can actually proliferate without moisture during in summer. Ideal temperatures for growth are between 70 and 85 degrees. So basically the most comfortable temperature that you have for people is probably going to be really comfortable for powdery mildew as well. So if you're enjoying the weather outside and it doesn't feel like it's too hot or too cold, then probably powdery mildew is having a really nice time too. Higher temperatures above 95 degrees don't kill the fungus, but it does slow it down. And a fun little fact that 1 spore can multiply to 50 million spores in just 3 weeks, given the right conditions. So it can turn into a big problem very, very quickly. So why do we care? It's the most widespread and destructive disease in grapevines. It's very good at slowing and stopping the ripening of grapes. So that's one of the biggest problematic parts of powdery mildew, and I'll go into more detail about that in a little bit. There's a mushroom-like aroma that you can actually smell in the vineyard many times. That can lead to wines with associated faults like green character or even mushroom to a really high degree. Damage to the fruit with infection can lead to secondary infections like botrytis, which can lead to other problems like Acetobacter. So it can be a whole cascade of issues if we have high powdery mildew infection. And then a common tool to kill fungus is elemental sulfur. And as I'll talk about in a little bit, elemental sulfur and wettable sulfur even can have some problematic effects in the fermentation and the resulting wines. So here's a little bit about how powdery mildew attacks vines. Basically, we can have a healthy looking leaf. And what can happen is that if we were to zoom in on that leaf and look at a cross section of the leaf, if we were looking at the sort of plant cells at the surface, what powdery mildew can do is it can sort of infect and hijack the actual plant cells using all the machinery of the cell, essentially hijacking it and stealing and robbing sugar from the actual plant leaf itself. And so this can happen basically without any symptoms on the leaf itself. After these haustorium or these sort of little structures have started to build inside of the plant, they'll start to form these kinetophores or conidium. And what that manifests itself as is the typical symptoms of powdery mildew, which is this powdery kind of fuzz on the leaves themselves. And so if we look at an infected versus healthy leaf from powdery mildew, a healthy leaf is able to assimilate CO2 normally and do photosynthesis. An infected leaf is not able to do photosynthesis, and so that's a problem from a grape ripening standpoint. And so if you're not able to assimilate sugar, you're not able to ripen the fruit, and then you have basically unripe fruit, which has all sorts of other issues that I'll talk about later. So powdery mildew effects on quality that we've seen, it decreases the alcohol, decreases red pigments, it decreases total phenolics. So all the symptoms we would typically expect to see from unripe fruit, we basically have higher green characteristics, and we have less phenolics. So it's a difficult situation from a wine quality standpoint because we have fruit that's not ripening. Other things that can happen specifically in Chardonnay, we can see issues with protein stability. So if we get concentrations of powdery mildew above 30% infection, we can see dramatic increases in tomatine-like proteins, which are related to protein instability. So we can have greater difficulty with protein instability if we have high levels of high levels of powdery mildew. So that's problematic for its own reasons. We'll have to add more bentonite in order to heat stabilize the wines. And so if you see a powdery mildew infection in the fruit, it's not only going to decrease the ripening, but also have some detrimental increases of these proteins. And it's doing this because the plant is actually producing these proteins as a defense mechanism against the powdery mildew. That's what the proteins that are most problematic for protein haze formation in wines are the same proteins that are the most difficult from a heat stability standpoint. So those are the ones that we're concerned with here. Other things that can be difficult. So when we have powdery mildew infection, typically vineyards will apply sulfur in order to deal with that. And if we have higher we'll typically have a little bit more sulfur in the vineyard. And so sulfur is good because it actually decreases the pressure from the powdery mildew. But one of the side effects that can happen in the wine is that we can increase the amount of hydrogen sulfide that's produced in the fermentation if we apply more sulfur and if we apply it closer to harvest. So on the left-hand side, you can see what happens is that the closer that we apply sulfur in different forms, either in micronized or elemental sulfur or in wettable sulfur, the closer we apply it to harvest, the more residual sulfur that we'll have on the grapes when we harvest. And that residual sugar or residual sulfur will translate into the juice or the must. And then we have a situation where we have a lot of residual sulfur. And as you look on the right, you can see that as you increase the amount of colloidal sulfur in the must, you increase the production of hydrogen sulfide. So hydrogen sulfide is a rotten egg aroma, and it can lead to other sulfides being formed. And so decreasing the amount of hydrogen sulfide is important because we don't want our wines to smell like rotten eggs for many reasons. So tips for whites with powdery mildew. What can we do for whites with powdery mildew pressure? Fining to remove off odors in the juice can be an effective method. So using something like activated carbon in the juice will help with removing some of those off aromas. You can use things like chitosan as well. If you have a secondary infection from powdery mildew, the chitosan will help deal with any extra issues that are coming with the fruit in terms of microbes. So step micro, we have an activated carbon called phenol-free that works really well in juices that doesn't remove color. So it's a non-decolorizing activated carbon, but it's a deodorizing activated carbon. So that works well for red musts and red wines. So activated carbon can be beneficial for those situations. Settling juices to a higher degree with high powdery mildew pressure or high residual sulfur will really help limit the amount of hydrogen sulfide produced in the fermentation. So using a good clarifying enzyme like the Zyme Easy Filter or the Zyme RS will help rapidly clarify a juice or a must. And that's going to help actually settle out any sulfur residues that come in with the fruit. So if you look over on the right, you'll see there's micronized or wettable sulfur applied in the vineyard. And the sulfur residue in a juice, as we increase the amount of clarification, so you'll see 24 hours after pressing, we have less sulfur residue because the sulfur actually will settle out with some of the gross lees when we're settling a white juice. So settling is your friend when you have a powdery affected lot, because it'll help remove some of those sulfur compounds. So tips for reds with powdery mildew. What can we do for reds with high powdery mildew pressure? We can do a hot fermentation. I'll talk more about this in a couple of minutes when I talk about green character, but hot fermentations can help with blowing off some of the green characteristics or some of the unripe characteristics that come with powdery mildew. And I'll talk more about that in D20 in a couple of minutes. Supplement the fermentation with tannin to increase the color preservation and structure, and also help sort of boost some of the phenolics, improving the quality of the overall must. Because we're not ripening the fruit to the same degree, the tannins that we're getting from that fruit is going to be different. And so you want to work with tannins that are a little bit softer. So skin-based tannins are better. And you basically want to probably try and limit some of the extraction of some of the bitter tannin from the seeds, because the seeds are often very unripe. So that might mean that you need to increase extraction. And so there's different things that you can use for that. You can use enzymes to increase the extraction rate. And then you can do other things like add exogenous tannins and press sooner so that you don't basically extract all of those bitter tannins from the seeds. And then you can do microoxygenation post-fermentation for green aroma removal. And I'll let Hamish talk more about the actual application of microox for that situation. So underripe green character compounds, there's basically there's a couple different classes of compounds that I'll talk about. IBMP is one of the more common associated compounds with green character, specifically in Cab Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon that are underripe. It's this green bell pepper kind of note that is characteristic and varietal for Cab Sauv, but at high levels can be really detrimental to quality because all you smell is green bell pepper. It's actually very strong aroma. IPMP, which is kind of a brother to IBMP. It's another kind of underripe, peppery kind of aroma. If you have ladybugs in the vineyard, the IPMP comes from ladybugs, and they can basically contribute to some of that green characteristic. And then you have C6 aldehydes that are more of a cut grass, kind of tomato leaf character, and that also comes with underripe fruit. So things that we can do for green character, we can use high fermentation temperature or high temperature to fix the green character. So we can use thermovinification or flash détente. When we use thermovinification or flash détente, we can remove a lot of the IBMP, which, as I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, microoxygenation is not as good at removing IBMP, but it can be removed with high temperature, either in the juice, or I'm sorry, in the must, or in the fermentation. So IBMP has a boiling point of 50 degrees Celsius, and so we can actually boil it off. We can remove it or volatilize it at higher temperatures. So that's one strategy we can use for that green characteristic, is high temperatures through thermification or flash détente. We can also just do a warmer fermentation. So we have a specific yeast that we basically isolated and developed specifically for hot fermentation. So the D20 is a yeast that we isolated from Paso Robles in California, specifically to handle really, really high temperatures. It can handle up to 98 degrees Fahrenheit in the fermentation. And this trial that we did comparing two different yeast strains with D20, we got the fermentation temperature up to only 90 degrees in this case, compared to two other yeast strains that were just at 80 degrees. And when we got the temperature up to 90 degrees, what we saw was a 17% decrease in the IBMP and the resulting must. So in this case, we only got it up to 90 degrees. If we got it up to 95 or even 98 degrees, we would blow off even more of that green characteristic. So higher temperature fermentations can be another tool in your tool belt in order to kind of blow off some of those green characters. Other things that we can use, so for hexanol or for the C6 compounds that I mentioned before, those grassy kind of cut grass or tomato leaf aromas, we can use a yeast combined with a source of glutathione. So we use classically two different yeasts in combination with a yeast derivative. So we have Q-citrus or ES488. Both have enzymatic activity for converting green smelling aromas. In combination with glutathione, those yeasts can actually convert a green character into a fruity or tropical note. So we can actually convert something from grassy to a fruity characteristic, either whites or reds. So I won't go over all of the biochemistry going on here, but basically just know if you have something like hexanol or grassy character, by using something like ES488 in a red must in combination with something like Pro Blanco, we can give basically yeast a source of glutathione with the Pro Blanco, and the yeast will take that glutathione, it'll basically attach it to the hexanol and spit it out as a fruity aroma. So you take a green character and you turn it into something that's more fruity. So that's another strategy that we can take for reducing green character. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about microox effect on pyrazines, and then we're going to sort of switch gears and let Hamish talk about microox specifically. So microox is something that can be used for green characteristics in aging. Microox does not actually work well for the bell pepper green character, which is why we have to use something during fermentation or in the must treatment in order to remove that IBMP or that bell pepper kind of aroma. But what we have found is that in combination with oak, microox can actually be very effective at removing IPMP, which is another green character that's associated with unripe fruit, or with ladybugs. So if you have ladybug taint in your wine, micro-ox in combination with oak can actually be a really good way to treat that, because the ladybugs contribute a lot of IPMP. So if you look over on the right, you'll see a trial that was done looking at the IBMP and IPMP for different treatments. And you can see with micro-ox, we're able to remove some of the IPMP alone, but micro-ox in combination with oak, we're able to almost completely remove the IPMP, which can be a big help when we're looking at removing some of those green characteristics. So I've just gone through a lot of information very quickly, but basically in conclusion, botrytis cinerea can be detrimental to phenolics, fermentation, and leads to microbial spoilage. So we can use enological tools like tannin to botrytis or stab micro to reduce the impact of botrytis. So using tannin or chitosan can basically help a lot with botrytis affected fruit. For powdery mildew, we can lead to underripe fruit and green characteristics. So utilize proper fermentation strategy to decrease green notes. Higher fermentation temperatures or thermovinification can blow off some of the green aromas. And then micro-ox and or combination of micro-ox and oak can help with the maturation to remove those issues as well. So that does it for my presentation at this point. I'm going to hand it over to Hamish and let him go ahead and talk a little bit about micro-ox. Hamish, you there?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Joshua. I'll just be a moment while I get my presentation going. Alrighty. So thanks very much for inviting me along to participate in the webinar. I'm Hamish Elmsley, one of the founders of a company called Wine Grenade, and the guy mostly responsible for the development of our products. For anyone wondering, the name Hamish it's the Scottish version of James, and it's a New Zealand accent that you're hearing. So I apologise if what I'm saying you have a little trouble understanding, but hopefully all the content will come through on the slides. I also have a small dog in the background, which you might hear at certain points in the presentation. So the intention of this, of these slides, is really to just touch on some of the motivations and key considerations about using micro-ox as part of an overall wine maturation strategy. It's a pretty big topic, and we can't get into a huge amount of detail today. So I just wanted to mention that we have another webinar that I've done with the team at Inatus, which goes into a lot more detail or a lot more depth. So I'm sure we can circulate that link at the end of this webinar for those who are interested. So I just wanted to kick things off by saying that oxygen has a role to play at pretty much every step along the winemaking process, and it's often been described as being the lifeblood of wine. So depending on how and when it's used, winemakers can expect to see a whole range of different effects, from increased resistance to oxidation, to stabilized color, to an improved aroma. So really just showing you here on this slide the number of kind of beneficial effects that winemakers can expect from micro-ox, depending on how and when it's applied within the process. So flipping on to the next slide. So diving a little bit deeper into the US market specifically, I just wanted to share some results from a recent customer survey that Wine Grenade undertook. So what you're seeing on screen is basically an overview of exactly what Wine Grenade's US-based customers were hoping to achieve with the use of our product. So one thing that I found really interesting about these results is that it really challenges the perception that some people have, which is that micro-oxygenation is mostly used or only used to accelerate the maturation of wine. As you can see by looking at some of these figures here, is that the actual acceleration of the maturation process was only selected by a small percentage of respondents. So the most popular goals, as you can see here, were softening structure, managing redox potential characters, and fine-tuning that aromatic profile. As a side note, I don't have the graphics for it, but a follow-up question in the survey asked, to what extent was Wine Grenade successful in helping these winemakers achieve these goals? And every single respondent scored either a 4 or 5 out of 5. So we know that micro-ox can be a really powerful tool in the cellar when it's used effectively. And to illustrate, just how powerful, I wanted to show you the set of results that we saw in a side-by-side trial from New Zealand. So this wine in particular is a Hawke's Bay Pinot Noir. The trial ran for a period of 10 weeks at a rate of 1 milligram per litre per month. During the trial, we had blind tastings undertaken by the chief winemaker and the head of red winemaking on a weekly basis. The wine grenade sample was consistently preferred throughout the course of that trial. So at the completion, we had a panel of independent winemakers come through and undertake a tasting, and they reached a similar conclusion. So the spider chart that hopefully you can see on screen, although our video might be blocking off half of it, essentially what you're seeing is the aggregate scores that that panel of independent winemakers gave those two wines. So the red line is showing you effectively, what the wine grenade treatment was responsible for with that wine. So positive gains across all of the metrics that were considered. So just looking now at a couple of kind of commercial considerations around the use of micro-ox in the cellar. The first one, which is a big driver for a number of our customers, is cost. So the figures that you're looking at here have been converted to US dollars from New Zealand dollars, so they won't be exactly precise, but the overarching message is pretty much the same, which is that a standard micro-ox and oak alternative maturation protocol can be around 9 times more affordable than an equivalent barrel aging regimen. And so this is particularly handy for those of you who want to grow their volumes without having to invest a lot upfront on new barrels, or maybe wanting to introduce a new product line at a more affordable price point. So micro-ox can be a really powerful tool in those scenarios. Another, or sticking with the topic of growth, another key advantage is the ability to scale production within your existing winery footprint. So what this slide is simply or graphically trying to illustrate is, exactly how much more a winemaker is able to produce at the exact same, in the exact same amount of space when using tank aging instead of or in addition to barrel aging. So going by these really simple calculations, the winemaker in this example would be able to mature almost 3 times the amount of wine in the same exact physical space. Other advantages, kind of associated with this are, or aging wine in tank are, less variability from vessel to vessel, easier sampling, and less laborious to manage. So talking a little bit about the wine grenade product and how we approach micro-oxygenation, how that's a little bit different to other products in the market. So the wine grenade was really born out of feedback that the company's founders were getting from within the wine industry, and that feedback was essentially that winemakers understood the power of using oak alternatives and oxygen together. But that there were essentially a number of hurdles preventing them from taking that leap. And that was especially the case, based on the research that we did for small to medium-sized wineries. And so some of the common hurdles or pain points, I guess you could call them, that we were hearing from these small to medium winemakers were, that existing micro-ox systems were costly, complicated to use, prone to things like clogging up, needing repairs and maintenance, and had some kind of problematic features, if you will. And so we basically set about designing a system that overcame all of those hurdles. And so the wine grenade's basically designed to be, really smart, simple, affordable solution for winemakers to easily incorporate an oxygenation program into their cellars. We use sensors and internet connectivity to basically ensure that the wine grenade operates effectively. The whole thing can be set up in 15 minutes, and at the moment the unit's priced around $1,000. So the other really unique attribute that we have with the wine grenade is the way that the oxygen is diffused into wine. So we've designed our product to basically mimic the way that an oak barrel breathes, except instead of diffusing through oak staves, we basically diffuse oxygen through a semi-permeable tube that goes inside the tank. Or in fact, it could be inside a barrel if you're using neutral oak barrels, or if you feel that the wine barrel could do with some extra oxygen. So just like a barrel, when we diffuse oxygen through the semi-permeable tube, there's basically no bubbles. The whole thing is super easy to use, and it genuinely can take as little as 15 minutes to get set up. For those of you who don't believe it's possible, I can send you a homemade video that I did outlining the installation, and it walks you through the entire process from start to finish in about 12 minutes flat. Once the unit's set up at your tank, you basically connect it to Wi-Fi and then use our free web application to program it with all the parameters that you're going to need for your maturation program. The other kind of innovation that we've brought to it is the invention of what we call an active float system, which is really just marketing speak for a thing that goes up and down inside your tank to move the semi-permeable tubing around. So what we're looking for with that active float system is essentially movement of the permeable tube, and so we're able to get a nice even distribution of oxygen throughout the volume of wine. The easiest way to think of it is like a pool shark with a fancy marketing name. So I think that's about all of the time that I have to cover off micro-oxygenation and specifically the wine grenade. I should mention that our product is sold through Inatus. So Joshua and his team are able to fulfill any kind of orders that if you want to try the wine grenade in your cellar, it can be purchased through Inatus. And for those of you who haven't tried micro-oxygenation before, or really keen to level up their understanding of the process and how to some of the considerations for incorporating it into your maturation program, I would encourage you to check out the other webinar that we did with Inatus, which basically walks you through step by step exactly what you need to do. So it's a really helpful resource. But yeah, on that note, I'll hand things over to Joshua or the team to maybe handle some questions.
Sure. I guess we can try and pull up some. It looks like maybe we had some questions come in. I see one from. Okay, let's see. Sorry.
I think the first question is, can the grenade be used to fix color between alcohol fermentation and fermentation?
Yeah, so I guess usually what we would see between alcoholic fermentation and malolactic fermentation is much higher rates of oxygenation for a shorter period of time. And so the wine grenade, the way that we diffuse oxygen through that semi-permeable tubing makes it particularly well suited for micro-oxygenation, where the rate of oxygen diffusion is slow and subtle over a long period of time, where we're really mimicking the way that the barrel works. I guess one of the downsides to that method of oxygen diffusion is in larger volumes of wine, it can be difficult to achieve the levels of oxygenation that are really beneficial at that point in the process. That isn't to say that we don't do it, and we do have clients that use it in this way, but usually we see that it's on smaller volumes of wine. So, for example, using it on a kind of flex tank volume of wine is seeing the technology applied in that way. And the only limitation is really the amount of tubing that needs inside the tool to achieve that oxygen diffusion rate that you're looking for.
Okay, thanks. We have one question here. What type of oak do you recommend with micro-axe?
Josh had talked to some of the oak that is in Anatas's range.
So there's a whole different range of types of oak they use. It just depends on the style that you're really looking for. The variations in oak as an alternative to be used with micro-ox are as ranged as a oak barrel, for instance, because essentially what we're doing is we're introducing oak in a similar fashion that we would with oak aging. So we have variations in toast level. So and we have variations of the actual source of the oak itself. And so the alternatives. So our range is called the Encanto range, and the way that we specify our range is looking at the different levels of toast and the botanical origin of the actual oak itself. And so that combination of those two things leads to a specific kind of characteristic that is associated with that toast level and botanical origin. So, for instance, we have one that's called dark chocolate, and as cheesy as that sounds, actually the oak intends to impart a lot of these sort of chocolatey kind of characteristics, and so that's sort of one way that you can look at it, is sort of what style are you looking for, and what sort of toast level you're looking for in terms of the kind of wine that you're trying to make. So you can use a lot of different kinds. Is basically the answer to that question. It really just depends on the style that you're going for. And we can sort of dive into that a little bit more in detail, specifically for whatever type of wine that you're making. But that's sort of a general answer to a question that I think can go in all different directions.